The ring hit the marble floor and rolled, 3 carats of cold fire skittering under a banquet table. While 200 of the city's wealthiest guests laughed, and the woman in the plain white dress got down on her knees on that marble in front of all of them and reached for it. She did not cry. She did not beg. She found the ring with her fingers, closed her hand around it, and stood back up with a straightness that made the laughter falter at its edges. "It's the first thing my husband ever gave me," she said, to no one and to all of them. They laughed harder. The wife of a security guard, kneeling for a ring they were certain was glass. The sister in the $8,000 gown. The groom who'd come to the wedding on a bicycle. What not one of them knew. Not the sister, not the man holding up his phone, not the manager who had just gone the color of paper at the far end of the hall, was that the bicycle had been a choice. That the name they were laughing at was carved into the stone beneath their feet, and that the man it belonged to had just walked through the door. Comment below where you're watching from, and stay until the end. The morning of the wedding, the Hartwell house was loud with everyone, except the bride who needed it most. There were 2 brides that day, getting ready under the same roof, and the house had arranged itself around the wrong one. In the front sitting room, where the light was good, Sloane Hartwell sat in the center of a small kingdom of attendants. A makeup artist hovered at her cheekbone. An aunt fussed with the train of a gown that cost more than some cars. Her phone never stopped lighting up, and every few minutes someone new leaned in to tell her she was the most beautiful thing they had ever seen. Sloane. And Sloane received each compliment the way a meter receives a coin, smiling, already waiting for the next. In the back of the house, in the room that used to be a sewing room, the other bride dressed herself. Della Hartwell was 26, the elder daughter of Roy Hartwell, and in her own father's house, she moved like a guest who has overstayed and knows it. She had done her own hair in the bathroom mirror with the door closed. She had pressed her own dress, a simple white one, nothing on it, the kind of dress that does not photograph and is not meant to. There was no aunt at her train because there was no train and no aunt. There was just Della and the quiet and the muffled sound of her sister being adored 2 rooms away. She had learned, a long time ago, not to mind it where anyone could see. She had a particular stillness she put on like a second dress, and she put it on now, and when her father appeared in the doorway, she was already wearing it. "You're ready," Roy said. It was not a question and not approval. He was a tall, careful man who had spent his life half a rung lower on the ladder than he believed he belonged, and he had passed the ache of that down to his daughters the way some families pass down a watch. He looked at Della's plain dress, and something tightened at the corner of his mouth. "Remember whose house you come from today. Whatever else happens out there, you do not embarrass this family." "No, sir. A nice dress can cover a lot." He said it to the mirror, not to her. It can't cover a small life. People can always tell. He left before she could answer, which was its own kind of mercy because there was no answer. Della looked at herself in the glass, the plain dress, the steady face, and she thought, not for the first time, that her father had spent 26 years describing her like a disappointing room he was trying to rent out, and that the strangest part was how rarely it landed anymore. You could only be told you were small so many times before the words stopped fitting. She had not always lived in this house. That was the thing none of them understood, the thing that made her impossible to wound in quite the way they kept trying to. When she was small and often sick, her parents had sent her away, out of convenience dressed up as concern, to live with her father, an old man named Ray Doyle, who fixed small engines in a town too small to find on most maps. They had expected her to hate it. She had been happiest there than she had ever been anywhere. Her grandfather had almost nothing. A workshop that smelled of oil and coffee, a porch, a single good chair. But he had looked at her every single morning like her arrival was the best thing that was going to happen to him that day. And a child can survive almost any poverty except the poverty of not being wanted, which is the only kind the Hartwell house had ever been rich in. Her grandfather had died when she was 19. She had come back to her father's house then, because there was nowhere else, and she had been a stranger in it ever since. She had learned, in the years after, exactly what wealth did to the people who chased it, how it made them measure a person by their shoes, how it turned love into a transaction and kindness into a weakness to be priced. She had decided, somewhere in there, that she wanted no part of any of it. She wanted a small life, a real one, a porch and a good chair, and someone who looked at her in the morning. She had told herself this was a value. Some of it was, and some of it, if she was honest in the dark, was a wall she'd built so high that no one could ever again get close enough to send her away. Today they were marrying her off, and they had not even pretended it was for her sake. It had come down from her father like a verdict. A connection, an old arrangement, a family her grandfather had apparently known. There was a man named Eli, of no particular standing that anyone in the Hartwell house could find, and Della was to marry him, and the way it had been explained to her made it clear that she was being moved off the board to make room for the daughter who mattered. Sloane was marrying Trent Marsh, Marsh of the Marsh fortune, the country club, the right last name, and a glittering wedding had been built around that, and Della's marriage to a nobody named Eli had been folded in beside it like an afterthought, a buy one get one, a way to clear the shelf. She had agreed to it. That was the part that scandalized them quietly, that she had not fought. But Della had looked at the man they were handing her to the few times she'd met him, a calm, plain-spoken man with careful hands and an old jacket and eyes that did not perform, and she had thought, he is poor and he is kind, and poor and kind is a thing I understand, and it is more than this house ever gave me. She did not love him. She barely knew him. But she had spent her whole life among people who looked rich and lived starved. And the idea of a small life with a gentle man felt less like a sentence than an escape. Della. Sloane was in the doorway now, radiant, cruel, only in the offhand way of a person who has never had to think about it. She held her bouquet against the white gown. I feel just awful. The two of us the same day, and look at. A flick of the eyes at the plain dress, the bare room. All this. Maybe we should switch bouquets. Let fate decide who marries who. She smiled. I only say it because I care. There's nothing to decide, Della said. It's all arranged. I know. Sloane's smile didn't move. I just wanted you to know I care. I know you do, Della said, and the flatness of it, the refusal to give her sister the flinch she'd come for, made Sloane's smile tighten a fraction before she carried it back out to the room full of people who would. Then, from the front of the house, there was a sound that started as confusion and turned, in the space of a few seconds, into delight. It rolled back through the rooms toward Della like a wave, a ripple of voices, a burst of laughter, somebody calling someone else to come and see, come and see. She heard her father's voice somewhere in it, low and furious. She heard Trent Marsh laugh, that particular laugh of a man who has found something he can use. And under it all, she heard the small, absurd sound that had started it. The tick and squeak of bicycle wheels, coming up the long paved drive of the Hartwell house, where a row of black cars sat gleaming for the other wedding. Her groom had arrived. She came out to the front steps because she would not be told, and she saw it the way the whole crowd saw it, all at once. Eli had ridden a bicycle to his wedding, not a fashionable one, an old steel-framed thing with a basket on the front, the kind a man might use to get to a job he could not afford to be late to, and he had ridden it up the drive past the line of Marsh family town cars in a clean but plain dark suit, and he had stopped at the bottom of the steps and put one foot down, and he was looking up at Della as if there were no one else on the property. The crowd had arranged itself into a half-circle of phones and open mouths. Trent Marsh stood at the top of the steps in a tuxedo that fit like it had been grown on him, and he was laughing without any attempt to hide it. A bicycle, he said loud, for the audience he could feel gathering. He came to a wedding on a bicycle. What kind of family lets a man arrive like this? Della. Eli's voice cut under the noise without rising to meet it. I came for you. Why would the Hartwells marry into this? Someone said, and someone else laughed, and Roy Hartwell stood rigid with the specific shame of a man watching his careful social arithmetic collapse in front of the exact people he'd built it for. Della. her father's voice low at her shoulder. If you don't want this, if you want to call it off, say it now, and I will end it. No one would blame you. Everyone would understand. And that, Della understood even then, was not mercy. It was an exit he was offering himself, not her. A way to make the bicycle disappear, to put her back in the sewing room and pretend the morning had gone differently. If she refused Eli now, in front of all these people, the blame would land on her, the runaway bride, the difficult daughter, and the family would close ranks around the version of the day they'd wanted. She could feel the whole crowd leaning toward it, wanting the drama, wanting her to break. She looked down the steps at the man on the bicycle. He was not begging. He was not ashamed. He had ridden a bicycle through a gauntlet of people who despised him, and he was sitting at the bottom of the steps with one foot down and the other still on the pedal, waiting, looking at her like the answer was entirely hers to give, and he would honor whatever it was. I'll marry him, Della said. The laughter caught in the air. Della, her father, sharper. Say that again. I'll marry him. She came down one step. I want a simple life. I want to be somewhere I'm not a burden. I know exactly what this house thinks I'm worth, and I would rather have a small true thing than a large false one. She came down another step, and another, until she was level with the bicycle and the plain man holding it. Let's go, she said to him quietly, just for him. Take me home. Something moved in Eli's face. Relief, and under the relief something more complicated. Something that almost looked like guilt, though she had no way of reading it that day. He steadied the bicycle. Hold on tight, he said. The road's not smooth. So she gathered her plain white dress in one fist and sat side saddle on the rack behind him and put her arms around the waist of a man she barely knew, and he pushed off down the drive past the gleaming cars. And behind them the wedding crowd laughed and filmed and called out things meant to wound, and Roy Hartwell did not come down the steps, and Sloane watched from the doorway with an expression that was not quite triumph and not quite something else. And the bicycle carried Della Hartwell away from the only house she had ever been told she belonged in, toward a life she could not yet see the shape of. She did not look back. She would think about that later, that on the worst-looking day of her life, she was the only person on that property who had not been performing. The room Eli took her to was small and clean, and on the third floor of a building with a security desk in the lobby. And the first thing Della felt when she stepped into it was not disappointment. It was relief. I work here, Eli said, setting the bicycle against the wall. Security, in the building. The room comes with the job. It isn't much. It's enough, Della said, and meant it, and watched the surprise move across his face. She walked the small room slowly. One window, but it faced east, and she could already see how the morning would come into it. A table by the window. A narrow bed, a kitchenette, a single good chair. It was, almost exactly, the shape of her grandfather's life, and standing in it she felt something in her chest unlock a notch she had not known was held. We could put flowers there, she said, touching the table. On the table, by the window. The morning light would catch them. She was a little surprised to hear herself say it. She had not planned to want anything out loud in front of this man. And someday, maybe, a small fish tank right there, a goldfish, and a chair here by the window, a real one, for reading in. Eli stood by the door watching her plan a life into his bare room, and his face was doing something she didn't understand. You thought you'd hate it, he said. I could see it, on the steps. You came down expecting to hate it. I expected to survive it, she said. I've gotten good at surviving things. Hating them is extra. She turned from the window. But this, I lived in a big house most of my life, Eli, and I was never once happy in it. The happiest I ever was, I was a sick kid in a one-room workshop that smelled like engine oil, with an old man who fixed lawnmowers and looked at me every morning, like I was good news. She didn't know why she was telling him this. She had told almost no one. That's all I want. A small life with someone who's glad I'm there. I'm not afraid of poor. I'm afraid of being somewhere I'm not wanted. That's the only thing I've ever been afraid of. Eli was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice had gone careful in a way she'd noticed later, that it always went careful when the truth got close. I'm glad you're here, he said. Della, I'm glad you're here. I want you to remember I said that. She would remember it. She would turn it over and in her hands 100 times, much later, trying to decide whether it had been a lie. The first weeks were better than any she could remember, and the strangeness of that crept up on her slowly. Eli was gentle in a way that did not seem like a performance. He left for his shifts and came back and asked about her day and listened to the answers. He brought home flowers, cheap ones, from a stand near the building and put them in a jar on the table by the window because she had said she wanted them there. He fixed the wobbles in a single chair without being asked. He was, she thought, the first person in her adult life who treated her presence as a fact to be glad about, rather than a problem to be managed. And then there were his parents, who were poorer than he was, and richer in the only way that had ever mattered to Della. His mother arrived one afternoon in a flurry of bright costume jewelry and an enormous laugh. A round, warm woman named Margaret, who took one look at Della and folded her into an embrace before a word had been said. "My daughter," she said, like it was settled, like it had always been settled. "Look at you. Welcome. This home is yours now, big or small. It's yours." She held Della at arm's length and beamed. "I told him you'd be beautiful. He's been too serious his whole life, this one. Maybe you'll teach him to smile." Eli's father, Gabriel, came another day. A quiet, dignified man with grease under his fingernails who, Eli explained, drove for a wealthy family across town and had done for years. He didn't say much, but he watched Della help his wife in the kitchen, watched her wash the dishes she didn't have to wash, and at the door, leaving, he stopped and put a hand briefly on her shoulder and said, "You're a good girl. You'll be good for him," and went out. And Della stood in the small kitchen with her hands wet and felt, for the first time since her grandfather died, like she had walked into a family instead of a transaction. She did not notice, those first weeks, the things she would later be unable to stop noticing. The quality of Margaret's costume jewelry, which caught the light a little too cleanly. The way Gabriel's hands, grease and all, were a working man's hands attached to a bearing that wasn't quite a working man's bearing. The way Eli, who claimed to watch a gate for a living, spoke about the world like a man who had been on the other side of a great many gates. She did not notice because she did not want to. She had been handed, against every expectation, a small, warm, true thing, and she had decided not to hold it up to the light for fear of what the light might show. The invitation came 3 weeks in, and it came, as everything cruel in Della's life came, wearing the face of love. Della, Sloane on the phone, bright as a knife. "There's a banquet. The Aldridge Hotel, a week from Saturday, a real event. The kind of thing, Trent's people will be there, everyone will be there. You and your husband should come." A pause delicate, "Unless you're ashamed." "I don't think we need to come, Sloane." "Oh, are you ashamed already? It's been 3 weeks." The smile came down the line. "Come show everyone your new life. I'd hate for people to think you're hiding." Della understood the trap completely, which did not make it any easier to step out of. If she refused, Sloane would say she was hiding, because she was ashamed. If she went, Sloane would have a room full of people and a reason. It was a trap with 2 doors and a wall. "I'll think about it," Della said, and hung up and stood holding the phone. Eli was watching her from the table. "Who was that?" "My sister. There's a banquet. She wants me to come and be made an example of in front of important people." She set the phone down. "It's a trap either way. If I don't go, I'm ashamed. If I go, she gets her show. Then don't go." Eli's voice had an edge she hadn't heard before, a protectiveness that surprised her. "You don't owe them a performance. If I don't go, they win quietly. At least if I go." She looked at the window, the cheap flowers, the small good life. "Sometimes I want to stand in that kind of room and let them see they didn't break me. I want them to look at me being fine and not understand how. Then I'll come with you." "No," she said it fast. "No, Eli. If you come, they'll do to you what they did at the wedding. I can survive them saying things about me." "I can't. I don't want to watch them do it to you. Let me go alone. I won't stay long." He looked at her for a long moment, and she watched him decide something. "I want to give you something," he said, "before you go." He went to a drawer and took out a small worn box, and when he opened it, the thing inside was so out of place in that small room that Della actually took a step back. It was a ring, an old one, heavy, a single large stone with the particular deep clarity that cheap stones never have, set in a band worn smooth by other hands across other years. "It's a family ring," Eli said. "It means a great deal. I want you to wear it." "Ellie, I can't. Where did you even—" "It was my grandfather's to give," he said, which was true, and was also the closest he came, in all those weeks, to the truth. "He wanted it to go to my wife. So it's yours." He took her hand and slid it on, and it fit, which startled them both. "With this ring," he said, quiet, almost formal, "I'm giving you my word. Don't take it off, Della. Whatever happens at that banquet, keep it on. Promise me." "I promise," she said. She turned her hand under the lamp, and the stone threw light around the small room like something that did not belong there, which it did not, in more ways than she knew. "I won't take it off." The Aldridge Hotel was the kind of place built to make a certain kind of person feel large and everyone else feel like they'd come in the wrong door. And Della walked into its ballroom in a plain dark dress with an old ring on her finger and made the conscious decision not to feel either. Sloane found her within a minute because Sloane had been watching the door. "You came." There was real surprise in it, and under the surprise, appetite. "And you wore that. Well, it really does suit a security guard's wife." She took Della's arm with a hostess's grip and steered her into the room. "Come, you have to meet some people. They'll find you fascinating." The people were a knot of men in good suits with the easy contempt of those who have never once worried about a bill. And Sloane fed Della to them like a party trick. "This is my sister," she announced. "She married for love. Isn't that romantic? Her husband works security at a building downtown." "How nice," one of them said, in the tone you'd use about a child's drawing. "And what is your husband's name, dear?" Said another, a heavy man Sloane introduced as Mr. Benson Cole, with the indulgent smile of a man preparing to enjoy an answer. "Eli Hayes," Della said. Something happened in the air. It was small and she almost missed it, but one of the men, older, quieter, a Mr. Dalton, who had drifted over from near the wall, turned his head sharply. The way you turn your head at a name you weren't expecting in a sentence. "Hayes," said Mr. Cole and laughed. "As in the Hayes group? As in the heir? My dear, did you marry the richest unmarried man on the eastern seaboard and forget to mention it?" The knot of men laughed. Sloane laughed loudest. "It's just the same name," Sloane said, wiping her eyes. "Hayes is a common name. Her husband watches a gate. Isn't that Della? Same name, very different life. It's a common name." Della agreed evenly and felt the ring on her finger like a small cold weight and did not understand why the quiet man, Mr. Dalton, was no longer looking at her face but at her hand. "Forgive me," Mr. Dalton said. He had come closer. His voice had changed, gone formal and slightly unsteady, and he was staring at the ring with an expression Della could not read. "That ring. Madam, may I ask where you—" He stopped himself. He seemed to be performing some rapid, frightening arithmetic. "Madam Hayes," he said, and gave a small, instinctive bow. "It is an honor." "Why?" said Sloane into the sudden strange silence. "Did you call her madam?" "Aye, forgive me." Dalton straightened, flustered, retreating into a manager's smoothness. A misunderstanding, the name. These things happen. But he did not stop looking at the ring, and as he moved away, he glanced back at Della twice. And each time his face did the same complicated thing, and Della stood in the middle of the gilded room, with a borrowed family ring on her finger, and the first cold thread of a suspicion. She did not want winding up through her chest. Why had he looked at her like that? Why had he looked at the ring like he'd seen it before? It was Trent Marsh who turned the evening from cruelty into something worse. He arrived at the knot of guests with a drink already in him, and a score to set from a wedding day where a man on a bicycle had, somehow, made him feel small in front of his own people. He looked at Della the way you look at a stain you've been given permission to wipe up. "The famous bride," he said. "Still proud, I see. Tell me, does your husband guard this hotel too? Should I tip him on the way out?" The men laughed. Trent's eyes dropped to her hand and lit. "What's that?" Is that supposed to be a wedding ring? He reached out and took her hand without asking, turning it under the chandelier, and his mouth curled. 3 carats. Flawless. A beat for the room, if it were real. You buy this off a cart, sweetheart? Is this what poverty calls a first gift? Give me my hand back, Della said. It's the first thing my husband gave me, she said when he didn't. It matters because he gave it to me. That's the whole reason anything matters. This. Trent laughed, delighted, working it off her finger. This is the best he could do. And he held it up, and the room leaned in, and Sloane's eyes were bright, and Della reached for it, and Trent's hand closed, and then opened, and he tossed the ring out over the marble floor with a flick of the wrist and said, "To the laughing room. If it means so much, go find it." The ring hit the marble and rolled, 3 carats of cold fire, skittering under a banquet table. And Della Hartwell, in front of 200 of the wealthiest people in the city, got down on her knees on the marble and reached for it. She did not cry. She found it with her fingers, closed her hand around it, and stood back up with a straightness that made the laughter falter at its edges, and she slid the ring back onto her hand and did not give a single one of them the breaking they had paid to see. At the far end of the hall, near a service door, the quiet manager, Mr. Dalton, had gone the color of paper, and a younger staffer was murmuring urgently in his ear, and Dalton was already moving, but Della didn't see that. She was looking at her sister. "You've done enough, Sloane," she said. "I've barely started." Sloane stepped close, and for a moment the performance dropped and what was underneath looked out, and it was not triumph. It was hunger, old and starved. "Why do you do this? You always act so innocent, like you don't even try. You came back from that village with dirt under your nails and everyone just noticed you. Do you know what I did to be noticed in that house? Everything. I learned every single thing they wanted and I became it, and you walked in barefoot from nowhere and took the only thing I was working for." "That wasn't my fault," Della said. "That makes it worse." Sloane's voice cracked just once, before the polish came back over it. "You married a poor man and rode off on a bicycle, and you still stand there like the world didn't beat you. I want to see you beg, Della. Just once. I want you to say I won." "I'm not going to do that," Della said gently, which was the cruelest thing she could have done, and they both knew it. That was the moment the doors at the end of the hall opened. It happened fast after that. The way a thing held back for too long always goes fast when it finally breaks. A woman in catering management swept toward the commotion. Marlene Pratt, brisk and self-important, the kind of mid-level authority that mistakes a clipboard for a throne. She'd been told there was a disturbance, a guest's wife making a scene, and she arrived already certain whose fault it was, because she had learned long ago to read a room by its clothing, and Della's clothing told her everything she wanted to believe. "You," Marlene said. "I don't know who let you in, but you're done. You've upset our guests." "I was invited," Della said. "By whom?" Marlene didn't wait. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to apologize to Mr. Marsh, and then you're going to leave, and you're going to do it quietly." Her voice dropped into something she clearly thought was power. "And if you want to keep this from becoming something worse, you'll get down. On your knees. You'll gather every bit of this glass and this nonsense you've scattered, and you'll do it where everyone can see that people like you know your place. Then, and only then, will I let you walk out of my hall." The room had gone very quiet now, the laughter curdling into the particular silence of people who came for cruelty and are discovering they have a stomach for it after all. Sloane's smile had frozen. Even Trent had gone still. And Della Hartwell looked at the woman with the clipboard, and she did not kneel. "I've heard of Mr. Dalton," she said evenly, "the general manager of this hotel. I haven't heard of you, Ms. Pratt, as someone with the authority to tell a guest to crawl." She let that sit. "I think the Hayes family might want to reconsider where they hold their events, if this is how the Aldridge treats the people they invite." The Hayes family. Marlene laughed, an ugly, frightened bark, because the name had landed somewhere even she could feel. "That's rich security. I want them out of my—" "Marlene," the voice came from the end of the hall, and it did not need to be loud. "Stop. Right now. Everything stops. Mr. Dalton was crossing the ballroom at something just under a run, and he was not flustered anymore. He had passed through flustered and out the other side into a kind of terror that had organized itself into total focus. And at his shoulder hurried two more staff, and the whole architecture of the room was already rearranging around the thing his face was telling them, before anyone understood what it was. Because behind Dalton, through the open doors, a man had walked into the ballroom in a plain dark suit, unhurried, and the staff were turning toward him the way iron turns toward a magnet, and Della's husband, the security guard, the bicycle groom. The wife's small shame was crossing his own hotel toward his own wife, while 200 of the richest people in the city slowly, dawningly, began to understand. Mr. Hayes, Dalton said, and bowed, actually bowed, a full instinctive bend at the waist, and the word went through the room like cold water. Sir, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize, said Sloane in a small voice that did not sound like hers. Is he calling him Mr. Hayes? Eli did not look at Dalton. He did not look at Trent or at Sloane or at the frozen Marlene with her clipboard. He crossed the marble floor straight to Della, and he stopped in front of her, and he looked at her hand, where the ring was back on her finger, and then he looked at her face, and what was in his own face was not triumph. It was something much harder to watch. It was apology. You came on your own, he said quietly, just for her, though the silent room heard every word. I told you I'd give you space, and you came in here alone, and they did this to you, and I let it happen by not being here. His jaw worked. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I should have told you who I was a long time ago. Who you are, Della repeated. The room was spinning very slightly. Eli, who are you? But he was already turning because the room was full of people who had just spent an evening laughing, and the consequences had walked in the door. And they could not all be dealt with gently. Mr. Marsh, Eli said, and now his voice did carry, flat and clear across the silent ballroom. You called the man who came to that wedding a gatekeeper. You remember the word? He let it hang. You only respect people you've already been told to respect. That's not a flaw I can fix for you. But you're going to learn tonight that it has a cost. He turned to Dalton. The Marsh and Hartwell parties are no longer guests of this hotel. See them out, politely. They came in laughing. They don't get thrown, but they leave. This is a misunderstanding, Trent said. His voice had climbed. Mr. Hayes, sir, I swear I had no idea. That's the whole point, Trent, Eli said, almost gently. You never have any idea. You'd have been perfectly happy to keep laughing. He looked at the man for one more second. My wife knelt on this floor in front of you. I'm not going to forget which of us did the kneeling. And Della stood in the middle of the ruined evening with the ring on her hand and the man she had married, revealing himself like a building emerging from fog, and she felt no triumph at all. She felt the floor of her life shifting under her for the second time in a month, and this time, it was the man she had trusted who was moving it. They did not speak on the way home. Eli had wanted to take her in a car. There was suddenly, it seemed, a car and a driver who called him sir, and Della had looked at it and said, flatly, the bicycle. And so they had gone home the way they'd come, her arms around his waist, the city lights sliding past, and the silence between them was the loudest thing she had ever ridden through. In the small room, with the cheap flowers in the jar, she finally turned to him. Tell me the truth, she said. All of it. Right now. No more careful sentences. And Eli Hayes, who had built a month of his life out of careful sentences, sat down in the single good chair he'd fixed for her and put his face in his hands and then he looked up and he told her. He was the heir to the Hayes group, the richest unmarried man on the eastern seaboard. The men at the banquet had said, and they had been, for once, exactly right. The mansion across town where his father supposedly drove and his mother supposedly cooked was the house Eli had grown up in. Margaret was not a cook. Gabriel was not a driver. They were Margaret and Gabriel Hayes, and they spent playing surfeitance once in their own family's story so that the lie would hold. And they had done it, Eli said, because they had begged him to tell her the truth, and he had been too afraid, and helping the lie was the only way they could stay close enough to make sure she was treated well. And the marriage, Della said. Her voice was very steady, which was how he knew how angry she was. The arrangement. My father said it came down from somewhere. Was that real, or was that part of it, too? It was real. And here Eli's voice changed. And for the first time all night, he was not apologizing. He was telling her something he clearly held as sacred. My grandfather arranged it before he died. Della, do you know how my family got its money? No. Neither do most people. The story they tell is about a great man who built an empire from nothing. The story my grandfather told me, at the end, was different. He told me that when he was a young man, he had nothing, and he was sick, and he was going to die in a bus station in a town nobody could find on a map, and an old man who fixed small engines took him in, fed him, gave him a cot in the back of a workshop that smelled of oil and coffee, asked for nothing, wanted nothing. Just looked at him every morning, my grandfather said, like his being alive was good news. Eli's eyes were wet now. That old man's name was Ray Doyle. He never knew what my grandfather became. My grandfather spent 50 years building something and never forgot the one person who'd been kind to him when he was nothing, and on his deathbed, he told me there was a debt that money couldn't pay, and that the man had a granddaughter, and that he wanted me to find her, and know her, and if she was anything like the old man who'd saved his life, to make her family. Really family, the kind we'd both been starved for. Della had gone completely still. My grandfather, she said. Ray Doyle. Your grandfather saved my grandfather's life, Eli said. 60 years ago, and asked for nothing. And the whole Hayes fortune exists because one poor man fixing lawnmowers was kind to a stranger. He spread his hands. That's the arrangement, Della. That's where it came from. It was never a transaction. It was the only debt my grandfather ever carried that he couldn't buy his way out of, and he handed it to me. And he was right about you. You are exactly like the man who saved his life. You looked at my bare room, and you wanted to put flowers in it. For a long moment, Della couldn't speak. The room had filled with her grandfather. The oil and coffee, the porch, the single good chair, the man who'd looked at her every morning like good news. To learn that the one truly good thing in her childhood had reached 60 years across the world and arranged, somehow, to come back and find her. It was almost too much to hold. And then the other thing landed, the colder thing, and it pushed the warmth aside. You hid it, she said. All of it. You let me marry you thinking you were poor. You let your parents pretend to be servants. You let my family laugh at you on a bicycle. And you let me kneel on a marble floor tonight in front of 200 people. And the whole time you knew. I had to know, Eli said. And there it was, the thing she'd been waiting for, under all the careful sentences. Della, I have spent my whole life being loved for what I have. Every woman, every friend, I could never tell. There was no way to tell. The money got there first, always, and stood between me and any chance of being known. When my grandfather told me about you, I thought, here finally is a way to find out. Marry her as a poor man. See if she's real. And you were. You were so real it. His voice broke. I kept meaning to tell you. Every day I meant to tell you. And every day I watched how much you hated the world I came from. How badly that world had hurt you. And I got more afraid, because I knew the minute I told you, you'd think the whole thing was a test you'd been put through without your consent. And it was. That's the part I can't make pretty. I tested you. I told myself it was wisdom. It was just fear wearing better clothes. You made me a fool, Della said quietly. I made myself a coward, Eli said. You were never the fool. I was the one too afraid to be known. I did the exact thing I hate the world for doing. I made my truth a thing I controlled and handed out when it was safe. I'm not asking you to forgive that tonight. I'm just asking you to believe that the man in this room, the one who fixed your chair and brought you cheap flowers because you said you wanted them, that man was real. The lie was about my bank account. It was never about my heart. Della looked at the ring on her hand. The heirloom they'd all been so sure was glass. I need to think, she said. Don't follow me into thinking. I'll come back when I've thought. But Eli, and hear her own voice, nearly went, the thing I told you, the only thing I was ever afraid of, being somewhere I'm not wanted. You knew that. I told you that the first night, in this room, and you held it. And you knew the whole time that you'd already arranged my entire life behind my back. You let me believe I'd finally found a place where nobody was managing me. And the whole time, I was the most managed I have ever been. She went to the window and looked out at the city and did not cry. And Eli sat in the chair he'd fixed and did not reach for her. Which was, she would think later, the first wise thing he'd done all night. She did not decide anything for 3 days. On the fourth, she told him she wanted to see it. The house, the life, the world she had married into without her consent. Not to move into it, but to look the lie full in the face so that it would stop having power over her in the dark. Eli took her across town the next morning, and the gate that opened for them was the gate he had supposedly guarded. And the staff who came out to meet the car did a thing that undid the last of Della's disbelief. They bowed. To both of them. "Welcome home, Mr. Hayes," the man at the door said, and then, turning with the same practiced respect, "Madam Hayes." "Madam," Della repeated under her breath. The word kept finding her. She had been called Madam by a frightened manager at a banquet, and now by a doorman who had clearly been calling her that in his head for a month. She walked into a marble hall that made the Aldridge look modest, and somewhere a housekeeper she'd never met inclined her head and murmured, "Madam." And Della understood that while she had been putting cheap flowers in a jar and calling a bare room enough, an entire household across town had known exactly who she was and had been waiting, with folded hands, for her to find out. And in the kitchen of that house, she found Margaret. Not the cook, never the cook, the lady of the place, standing at a counter she did not need to stand at, because some part of Margaret had clearly decided that if Della was going to be lied to, the least she could do was keep cooking the meals herself, so that one true thing in the arrangement was genuinely hers. Margaret saw Della's face and put down the spoon and crossed the kitchen and took both her hands. "I wanted to tell you," she said. "From the first week," I told him. "My daughter," I said. "Eli, this girl is not those other women. You cannot do to her what the world did to you." He wouldn't hear it. He was so afraid. Her eyes were wet. "We are not good liars, his father and I. Do you know how hard it is to pretend to be a driver in your own front hall? Gabriel nearly called a man, sir, who has worked for us for 30 years. A small broken laugh. "We did it because helping the lie was the only way to stay close enough to make sure you were treated like family. That part was never a lie, Della. The way we love you. That was the truest thing in the whole house." Gabriel found Eli that same afternoon in the study, and Della heard the edge of it through a door left ajar. The quiet, dignified man who had played a driver, no longer playing anything. "The longer she believes it, the worse it lands," Gabriel was saying. "You know this. Your mother knows this. A lie doesn't get gentler because you hold it longer, son. It gets heavier, and then it falls, and it always falls on the person who least deserves it." A pause. "You tested her. She passed. What exactly are you still waiting to find out?" "I'm not waiting to find out anything," Eli said low. "I'm afraid. There's a difference." "There isn't," Gabriel said. "Not to her, there won't be." Della moved away from the door before they could know she'd heard, but she carried it with her. The proof that the gentle in-laws she'd loved had spent a month begging her husband to stop wounding her, and that he had chosen his fear over their counsel every single day. It did not make her hate him. It made something sadder than hate. It made her see him clearly, which is the more dangerous thing. The next days were a strange suspended thing, and into them, because trouble is never satisfied with one front, came Sabrina Vale. Sabrina was a problem that predated Della, though Della hadn't known it. The Hayes group did business with the Vale family, and somewhere in the long negotiations of money marrying money, a notion had taken root in Sabrina that she would one day be Mrs. Hayes, a notion no one in the Hayes family had ever actually agreed to, but which had hardened in Sabrina into something between an expectation and a religion. She had spent years arranging herself around a future that was hers by right. And then a security guard's wife in a plain dress had turned out to be the obstacle. She came to the mansion. Della had, by then, agreed to go there, not to live but to see, to understand the world she'd married into. And she found Della in a hallway and took her for staff, which told Della something true about Sabrina before Sabrina said a word. You must be new. Sabrina had a beautiful, cold, certain face. I have a very particular connection to this house. I'm going to be the lady of it. So if I tell you you're dismissed, you're dismissed. You can go. I wasn't hired by you, Della said. Excuse me, you can only dismiss someone you hired. Della had spent her whole life being told to know her place by people frightened of losing theirs, and she had developed in self-defense a perfect evenness that drove such people to the edge. I'm only explaining. People like you, Sabrina said, color rising, should know your place. And that was the moment Eli came around the corner, and the temperature of the hallway dropped. Sabrina, he did not raise his voice. What are you doing in my house? Ellie, finally. This person, Sabrina gestured at Della, is rude, and I don't like her. Send her. You don't give orders here. Eli stepped between them, and Della watched him do, for her, the thing he had failed to do at the banquet, the thing he'd frozen on. He did not freeze now. And let me be clear, since you've apparently told a number of people otherwise, there is no future between us. There never was. Our families do business. That is the entire extent of it. You will not come to this house again uninvited, and you will not speak to my wife as if she's hired help. Your wife, Sabrina's face, had gone white. Her? Eli, think about our families, the business, everything we. There's nothing we built, Eli said. You built it alone, in your head, and I should have corrected you years ago, and I'm sorry I didn't, because clearly it's curdled into this. But it ends now. Sabrina left. But she did not leave the story, because on her way out she had already begun, in the cold, certain engine of her mind, to look for an ally. And the city was not large, and a woman scorned by the Hayes heir did not have to look far to find another woman who hated Della Hartwell. Within a week, Sabrina Vale and Sloane Hartwell had found each other, two people united by the single belief that Della had taken something that was rightfully theirs, and they had begun, between them, to plan. It came to a head in the mansion's kitchen, and it came to a head because Della had insisted, against everyone's discomfort, on still doing things with her hands. She would not be idle. That was the part of her that her grandfather had built and that no fortune would ever unbuild. So even as the truth reorganized her life, she helped Margaret in the kitchen. Because Margaret was the one person in the whole strange new world who felt like home, and on the morning it all broke, Della was at the counter, and Sabrina Vale walked in looking for her. What followed was ugly and fast. Sabrina, who had been told by Sloane exactly where to press, accused Della of chasing other men, of using her marriage as a ladder, of being exactly the kind of climber Della had spent her whole life refusing to be. And when Della would not give her the fight she came for, Sabrina reached out and shoved a heavy ceramic cup off the counter, and it shattered. And she said, in a voice meant to carry, "Look what you've done. Clean it up, now. You broke that," Della said. "Clean it up." Sabrina grabbed her wrist. The same instinct the guard had used at the wedding, the same instinct Trent had used with the ring, the wrist reaching out to move the poor like furniture. And in the grab and the pull, Della's hand came down on the broken ceramic, and a bright line of red opened across her palm. That was the scene Eli walked into. His wife bleeding, Sabrina standing over her with her face still arranged for an audience that hadn't arrived. And something in Eli Hayes, who had spent a lifetime keeping his voice low and his truth controlled, finally came all the way off its hinges. "Don't you ever," he said, very quietly, crossing the kitchen, "speak to my wife again. Don't write her. Don't come near this house. Don't say her name." He took Della's bleeding hand in both of his, with a tenderness that was somehow more frightening than rage. "Get out of my house, Sabrina. The business with your family is over as of this morning. I'll absorb whatever that costs. You are not worth what it would cost me to keep being polite to you." And Sabrina Vale, who had built her whole future on being Mrs. Hayes, was escorted out of the house she'd been certain she would one day own, and she did not grovel, and she did not weep with remorse. She went out cold and furious and unrepentant, promising with her eyes that this was not the end, which it was, because the powerful, when they finally decide to stop being polite, do not need to make threats. They simply stopped returning the calls. It was the bleeding hand, in the end, that brought everything down. Because the bleeding hand sent Della to a doctor, and the doctor found something neither of them had known. She had fainted, after the kitchen. The blood, the shock, the long accumulated weight of a month of revelations finally cashing in all at once, and Eli had carried her to the car himself and would not let anyone else drive, and at the hospital they had cleaned and stitched her palm and run. As a matter of course, the rest of the tests, and a tired, kind doctor had come out to where Eli was pacing and said the words that changed the shape of everything again. She's stable. She fainted from stress and exhaustion, nothing more, and the cut is clean. A pause. And there's something else, and it's good news. Your wife is pregnant. Early but healthy. She'll need rest, and as little stress as you can possibly arrange, which? The doctor glanced at the chaos of the day. I gather may be a tall order. Eli stood in the hospital corridor and felt the ground move under him a third time, and this time it moved toward something instead of away. When Della woke, the small room was a hospital room, and Eli was in the chair beside the bed, and the whole truth of the last month was sitting between them like a third person. I fainted, she said. You did. He took her unhurt hand. You're all right. You're both all right. Both? Della. His voice was very careful, and this time the care was not hiding anything. It was the care of a man holding something that might break. We're going to have a baby. She put her free hand on her stomach. The ring caught the hospital light. And for a moment, before anything else, before the anger, before the unresolved, enormous question of what she was going to do, there was just that, the small, impossible fact, and she watched it land in Eli's face too, and for one suspended moment the two of them were not a poor woman and a secret billionaire, not the deceived and the deceiver, but two people who had just been told that the thing between them, whatever its lies, had made something true. A baby, she said. Our baby, he said, and his voice cracked all the way through, and Della looked at this man who had wronged her and loved her, and could not, it seemed, do either by halves. And she understood that whatever she decided now, she would not be deciding it alone. The banquet was Eli's idea, and Della agreed to it for one reason. She wanted to watch certain people learn certain things in public, and she had earned that. He built it as an apology and a coronation at once. A hall, the city's people. An evening designed to introduce Della Hayes as his wife, and to ask, in front of everyone who had ever laughed at her, for a forgiveness she had not yet decided to give. She let him build it. She arrived in a dress she chose herself, the ring on her hand, and she did not pretend even to herself that she had made peace with the man beside her. She had not. She was simply done letting other people decide when she walked into rooms. The Hartwells came, because Sloane could not stay away from a Hayes event even now. And Trent Marsh came on her arm, and they came expecting, on some animal level, that the wheel would turn back, that proximity to power would be extended to them again, the way it always had been. They had spent their lives being forgiven for cruelty by people who needed their money or their name. They did not yet understand that the Hayes family needed neither. Eli stood up before the room, and he did not make a speech about love. He made a single, quiet, devastating set of statements, and he made them looking at his wife. This is Della, he said, my wife. Some of you were at a wedding a few weeks ago where a man arrived on a bicycle and a family laughed. That was me. The bicycle was a choice. I wanted to know whether the woman I was marrying could love a man with nothing, because I have spent my whole life being loved for what I have, and I had forgotten what the real thing even looked like. He paused. She could. She did. She put flowers in a bare room and called it enough, and I repaid that by lying to her for a month and letting her be humiliated, and I will spend a long time earning back what that cost. I'm telling you this because she deserves to have it said out loud, in the same kind of room where she was once told to crawl. The room was silent. Sloane's face had gone rigid, and then Eli turned, unhurried, to the Marsh and Hartwell tables, and the second half of the evening began. No family that mocked my wife rises through the Hayes group, he said. That's not vengeance. It's just the end of an arrangement you were never actually part of. Mr. Marsh, you came here tonight expecting your partnership with us to go forward. It will not. And before you decide to be loud about it, he nodded toward the back of the hall, where a young woman Della didn't recognize had been quietly seated. I think there's someone here who has something to say to you. She came to me last week. She has documents. The young woman stood. She was visibly pregnant, drawn, and frightened, and she looked at Trent Marsh across the silent room and said, in a voice that shook and held, "He told me Sloane was for the family. He said it was just for show. He's been with me for months." And she had papers, and the papers did not lie, and the room turned, 200 faces, towards Sloane Hartwell, who had spent her whole life performing for exactly this audience, and now stood in front of it watching her great prize curdle into the oldest, most public humiliation there is. "Cynthia, Sloane, I can explain," Trent was saying, "the way men say it." But the room was already gone from him, and Sloane was looking at Della, and her face had come apart, and Frossorsant, the starved girl underneath the gown, looked out, the one who had learned every single thing the family wanted and become, only to find that the family's love was a currency that bought nothing real. Della did not gloat. That was the thing several people noticed and could not explain. She watched her sister's world collapse, and she felt no triumph, only a strange flat sorrow, because she understood, better than Sloane ever would, that they were two daughters of the same cold house, and that the only difference between them was that Della had been sent away young enough to be loved by an old man who fixed engines, and Sloane had stayed, and learned to live on a love that was always conditional, and called it winning right up until the night it didn't. And then Roy Hartwell made his mistake. He crossed the room to Della, to his elder, called Small, the one he'd called Small off offer to call off a wedding to save some embarrassment, and he opened his arms, and his face had rearranged itself into warmth, and he said, "Della, my daughter, you're home. It was always meant to be this way, the two of us, family." Was it? Eli's voice cut across him, quiet and cold. "She was your daughter when she was kneeling on a marble floor looking for her ring, Mr. Hartwell, and you weren't there. She was your daughter when she lived 19 years in your house, feeling like a guest, and you let her. She was your daughter on a bicycle, and you stayed on the steps." He let it land. "You remembered you had a daughter the same week. You learned what her husband's name was worth. I'd think very hard about whether you want me to say the rest of that sentence out loud in this room." Roy Hartwell's arms came down, and he did not grovel, and he was not forgiven, and there was no warm reconciliation between the cold father and the daughter he'd failed. There was only a man learning, far too late and in front of everyone, the exact price of love that arrives on a schedule set by money. He left the banquet a smaller man than he'd entered it, and no one stopped him. And that absence of grand punishment was, somehow, the most complete punishment of all. He simply ceased to matter, which was the one thing Roy Hartwell had spent his whole life terrified of. Sabrina Vale was not there. She had not been invited, and the business that had been her whole imagined future was finished, and she spent that evening, as far as anyone knew, alone, planning a comeback that would never find a door to enter through. Marlene Pratt, who had told a guest to crawl, was no longer employed by the Aldridge, which had been quietly informed that the Hayes Group would no longer hold its events in a hotel that treated invited guests like vermin. The Aldridge had drawn the obvious conclusion within the hour. And in the center of it all stood Della, in a dress she'd chosen, with an old ring on her hand, watching the entire architecture of cruelty that had defined her life come down around her, and feeling, to her own surprise, that it had very little to do with her at all. The people who had spent her life telling her she was small were being measured at last. And the measurement was not her doing. She had only ever stood still and refused to break. The breaking had all been theirs. What was left, when the hall had emptied, was the hardest part, and it had nothing to do with anyone but the two of them. They went home. Not to the mansion. Della had refused the mansion, gently and completely, the way she refused most things that were offered to manage her. She had agreed to a house, eventually, a real one, but a modest one, on a street with trees, where the rent could have been paid by a security guard if it had to be, and where she could stand on a floor and know it was actually hers. Eli had not argued. He was learning slowly that the cost of having lied to her was that he no longer got to decide things for her good, and that this was not a punishment but simply the shape of the trust he'd have to rebuild, board by board. They sat on the porch of the new house in the evening, the way she had once sat on her grandfather's porch, and she finally said the thing. "You gave me what my family never did," she said. "I want you to know I know that. Protection, patience. You stood beside me when everyone I was related to turned away. At the wedding, you held out your hand when I was alone. You carried me out of that kitchen. That's all real. I'm not pretending it isn't." She turned the ring on her finger. "But you also made the one thing I told you I was afraid of come true. I told you I'd spent my whole life being managed, sent where I was convenient, loved on a schedule that suited other people. And you let me believe I'd finally escaped that. And the whole time I was inside the most managed thing of all. A test I didn't know I was taking. The word safe stopped meaning anything to me, Eli. That word got heavier than this whole life you're trying to give me." "I know," Eli said. He didn't defend it. That, more than anything, was the thing that kept her on the porch. "I'm not going to tell you it was wisdom. It was fear. I was so afraid of being loved for the wrong reason that I made you carry the cost of my fear. And that's not love, that's just a nicer-looking version of the thing I hate the world for." He looked at her. "I'm not asking you to be over it. I'd be suspicious of you if you were. I'm just asking to be allowed to keep proving it. Not with a banquet, not with money, just every day. The way I fixed your chair, one ordinary thing at a time, until the word safe means something again, or until you decide it never will. Either way, I'll keep showing up. That's the only promise I have left that's worth anything." Della was quiet for a long time, watching the trees. "One step at a time, then," she said finally. "I haven't forgiven everything. I want to be clear about that, because I'm done with people deciding how I feel for me. The lie wounded me, and it's going to take what it takes. But I'm not leaving. I'm choosing to stay slowly, with my eyes open, and that's a different thing than forgiving you, and you're going to have to be able to tell the difference." "I can tell the difference," Eli said. "Good," she said. "Our child is going to grow up in a house where the truth is just normal, where nobody tests anybody, where being wanted isn't a thing you have to earn by becoming what someone needs." She put her hand on her stomach. "I had that once. For a few years in a workshop that smelled like oil and coffee. I'm going to build it again, and you can help. But only if you understand that's what we're building, and not a fairy tale where the rich man's love fixes the poor girl. I'm not the poor girl. I never was. I was just the only honest person in every room they put me in." "You were," Eli said. "You are." She let him take her hand, the unhurt one, and they sat on the porch of the small truce house as the light went. Two people at the beginning of something slow and real, and neither of them said anything else, because the rest of it was going to be made out of days, not declarations, and they both finally understood that. In the garage of the modest house, between a sensible car and the wall, there is a bicycle. It is an old steel-framed thing with a basket on the front and a rack on the back, the kind a man might use to get to a job he could not afford to be late to. It is worth nothing. The man who owns it could buy 1,000 of any bicycle made, and instead he keeps this one, oiled, the tires full, leaning against the garage wall of a house with trees on the street. Their daughter learns to ride a two-wheeler in that driveway one summer, and the old bicycle is there in the shade the whole time. She asks about it once. Why keep the rusty one? Her mother says only that it carried her home once, on the worst-looking best day of her life, when she was the one person on a whole street of laughing people who was telling the truth. The child runs back to her own bright bike in the sun, and the rusty one waits in the shade where they can see it. And that is enough.